My name is Emmanouil Dimitrakakis, a PhD student with the Wellcome and EPSRC Center for Surgical and Interventional Sciences at University College London, and for IPCAI 2021 I will be presenting our work on an intuitive surgical handle design for robotic neurosurgery. Before describing our surgical handle design, it would be beneficial to share some information on the surgical approach that we are trying to enhance with our robotic instrumentation. This approach is the expanded endoscopic endonasal approach that expands the transsphenoidal procedure. The latter, one of the best examples of minimally invasive brain surgery, is done through the nasal channel and aims to remove tumors right at the base of the brain near the pituitary gland. Trying to capitalize on the advantages of minimally invasive approaches, such as fewer complications and faster recovery, surgeons have expanded the transsphenoidal approach to include more areas besides the pituitary gland, leading to the expanded endonasal approach. However, operating in this way is not universally adopted since these areas are very difficult to reach. Thus, robotics could enhance these procedures and make them easier by adding articulation and force feedback. To try and aid keyhole neurosurgery, we are developing ergonomically designed handheld robotic devices. In this work, we will present an intuitive handle design for such neurosurgical robots. Our handle maps the surgeon's wrist movements directly to the robot joint's movements and is forearm mounted as to alleviate the surgeon of any wrist fatigue or strain by transferring the weight of the design from the surgeon's forearm to the wrist. After we developed the handle, a consultant neurosurgeon evaluated its performance and limitations within a custom surgical task simulator. The field of handheld medical robots is hugely populated with well-established as well as promising commercial and research devices, with these systems representing just a small part of the state-of-the-art. Most handheld robots have been designed with requirements to cater to a specific application, thus it is difficult to come up with a consensus on ergonomic design guidelines. Having said that, going through literature, there are some trends that are made repeatedly among the developed devices. As it is evident in the presented systems, most handheld devices employ finger-operated actuation mechanisms such as joysticks, triggers, and knobs, and have a standard cylindrical grip handle. Other than those traditional surgical handle designs, some devices implement direct mapping between the end effector and the surgeon's hand movements in a non-robotized way. The main reason why we are focusing our development on a handheld device rather than a tele-operated platform is evident in this pair of pictures. Handheld robots have a much smaller footprint than grounded platforms and are easier to integrate in the surgical workflow. Traditionally, they have smaller costs and it is easier for the surgeons to be trained on their usage since they resemble standard instrumentation. Despite these positive traits, developing a handheld device has of course a number of obstacles, namely the miniaturization challenges as well as the difficulty in combining a fully functional robotic device with ergonomics. The first step into developing our handheld device was the manufacturing of its robotic end effector. In previous work, we developed a miniature spherical joint end effector with 3 degrees of freedom and evaluated it for its repeatability and structural integrity using a test bench actuation setup. Having developed the end effector and before we developed a fully functional surgical device prototype, we focused on the isolated prototype of its handle presented in this paper. Our ergonomic solution has dimensions of 42 centimeters in length and 16 centimeters in height, while it weighs less than 500 grams. It employs a 4 degrees of freedom joystick to manipulate the robotic end effector joints by directly mapping the surgeon's wrist movements to the joint space of the robot. It is mounted on the surgeon's forearm with adjustable straps, aiming to alleviate the surgeon's wrist of any fatigue and strain, and the gripper is operated via a rotating pen-shaped trigger. As previously mentioned, when designing an ergonomic surgical device, it is difficult to find design guidelines that contribute towards improved human factors. However, there are some instructions that are popular in literature and our handle was developed with these ergonomic suggestions in mind. The handle should be universally used by surgeons of different hand sizes, its actuation means should be finger operated, and when the surgeon is not actuating the handle, their hand should maintain a resting pose. Simultaneously, the wrist should not support too much weight, and in order for the handle actuation to be intuitive and easy to pick up, the robot joint's movements should resemble the surgeon's wrist movements. In these two pictures, we can see how the handle at rest is maintained by a resting hand, as well as how the movements of the wrist are directly mapped onto the robot joints. Following these design suggestions, we designed and prototyped the ergonomic handle using additive manufacturing. To test its efficacy, we paired it with a previously developed end effector in simulation, using optical markers to track the shaft of the handle in the simulated 3D environment. The simulation environment used was Copilia Sim, and the chosen surgical training task was a PEG transfer training task, since in constrained spaces it can resemble the demanding requirements of minimally invasive neurosurgery. This experiment was a comparative experiment between our handle prototype and a standard neurosurgical tool. This video showcases the experimental setup and an effort to transfer all rings from one set of pegs to the other with a conventional tool first and our handle prototype next. The experimental setup included a simulated robotic end effector controlled by the physical handle prototype, a simulated non-articulated end effector controlled by a physical conventional neurosurgical tool, and a simulated endoscope to control the camera view. All physical tools were constrained in space by a 3D printed skull constraint, edited to include all the areas of interest of the endonasal approach. Finally, to represent the tool's movement in 3D space, all devices were optically tracked and their position transformed from the tracking software to our simulator. It was clear that the added dexterity of the articulated end effector would theoretically outperform the conventional non-articulated tool. However, constraining the handle on the surgeon's forearm could lead to loss of that added dexterity, and this is what we wanted to investigate it with this comparative experiment. An expert neurosurgeon specializing in endonasal approaches carried out the comparative experiment using each tool for a total of 20 attempts with a maximum duration of 2 minutes per attempt using the conventional handle first. The objective metrics used to compare the two instruments were the number of attempts it took to complete the task for the first time and the task success rate. Additionally, the learning curve when operating with the handles was investigated. To examine the ergonomics of the proposed handle, a researcher was observing the surgeon during the experiment, completing parts of the rapid upper limb assessment, a validated measure to assess the ergonomics of operating posture. Finally, and after the experiment was completed, the surgeon was asked to complete the surgery task load index questionnaire for each of the two tools, the most commonly used subjective assessment of perceived cognitive load among individuals within a surgical team. The results of the comparative experiment showcased that the handle outperformed the conventional tool in the objective metrics category, suggesting that a learning curve is potentially non-existent since the surgeon was able to complete the simulated task almost immediately. Additionally, the handle was deemed ergonomic enough at the worst posture throughout the experiment. To summarize, in this work we presented an intuitive surgical robotic handle prototype that is ergonomically designed to directly map the surgeon's wrist movements to the robot joints and to be mounted on the surgeon's forearm to alleviate the risk of any fatigue or strain. Based on the comparative experiment results, this forearm constraint did not lead to any robotic dexterity loss, hinted at a small or possibly non-existent learning curve, and was deemed ergonomic enough based on observation. Of course, and despite these promising results, there are some limitations in our work. The handle is still in prototype stages, which means that it will require redesign when it is paired with the end effector in a physical prototype. The surgeon's experience could have impacted their performance with a conventional tool, since they have a preferred surgical setup that did not necessarily agree with our universal experimental setup, and the fact that they used the conventional tool first could have contributed towards the small learning curve of the handle prototype. Finally, and most importantly, a single user subject study is limited, and thus in future work we plan on evaluating the handle in a larger scale study where a number of different participants will carry out the experiment in random tool sequences. The final step in our device development will be to combine this ergonomic handle with a previously developed end effector to create a fully functional neurosurgical robot that will hopefully enhance keyhole neurosurgery. Thank you for your time. I will be happy to answer any questions during the interactive session or via email. I will sign off with a brief look at the reference list of this presentation.